Yo, Elliott.
Yo, Elliott. I've always had a great relationship with my mother, but my father and I have always butted heads. Now that I'm a married man, I have a family, he's still the same. He also was an unhealthy type of alpha male at home with my mother. It now affects my wife's relationship with me. My mother defends my dad. They don't get along. They were not charitable with my wife and not very welcoming. I want my wife and parents to get along, but my wife won't forgive them, and my parents don't think they did anything wrong. I want to have a good relationship with my parents, if possible with my dad, and at the same time, I don't want to fight with my wife. I feel caught in the middle trying to keep both sides happy. Question number one, how should I go about this situation? Should I try and be the middleman and make peace? Do I defend one side over the other? Any recommendations? Number two, how can I be the husband and father God has called me to be? Long question, sorry. Needless to say, I need your guidance. I'll be watching the recording. Okay, good. So question number one, how should I go about this situation? Should I be a middleman and make peace? Do I defend one side over the other? Any recommendations? Well, my answer to this one will come straight out of the Bible, come right out of Genesis. And Jesus even refers to it when he says, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and becomes one with a woman. You are to essentially be one with your wife now. And so to stand between your wife and your parents is unbiblical. It's unchristian. It's against the natural law. You are one flesh with your wife. If your parents denigrate your wife, they denigrate you. It's just like a part of your body. Paul even says this in Ephesians and Corinthians, I believe, that your wife is to be treated as a part of your body. He says it's a mystery. As strange as that may sound, your wife is considered one flesh with you. So do you separate consideration for yourself, your whole self, from a limb? No, you don't. My whole self includes my limbs. Your wife is now a part of you. So if anything happens to your wife, it's happening to you. That's the right way to consider it. And in the same light, this is concomitant with your leaving of father and mother. So to answer your question, you always defend your wife. And that doesn't mean that you sin against your parents. It doesn't mean that you denigrate your parents. It doesn't mean you disrespect your parents, but you see things from your wife's point of view first. She may be wrong, but she's your responsibility. In other words, does that make sense? You can't shun your wife, turn your shoulder against your wife, take your parents' side and point at your wife. That would be the wrong way to go about it. You got to put yourself in your wife's shoes, or you got to see things from your wife's perspective, or you've got to lovingly, charitably admonish your wife, rebuke your wife, and correct your wife if that's what's needed. But she is your responsibility. Your parents aren't your first responsibility. She's a part of your flesh. You came from your parents' flesh. Does that make sense? So you're oriented towards her first, as long as she's not causing you to stumble or sin. Now, question number two. I see my father and myself at times in how I am with my wife and my children and so on and so forth. So you are your father's essence. This is normal. This is natural. But the hang up that keeps you resistant against the part of yourself that reflects your father has to do with unforgiveness. You and I are not very different in this regard. I didn't get along very well with my dad when I was young. My dad's a tough alpha male type of guy. It wasn't until much later in my 20s and 30s that I began to be able to see him more clearly because of distance that I created. My dad could go on and on and on about whatever. He could disagree with me. He can make points. Nothing my dad says really can ever make me mad. There's nothing that my dad can do that would make me not love him 100%. And it has everything to do with being able to see him for who he is, appreciate that regardless, because I'm not attached. I've forgiven, and my love for both of my parents is not emotional. My love for my parents is logical, meaning even lawful, right? It's the fourth commandment. Honor thy mother and father so that you could live a long and healthy life. I think it's the only commandment that's attached to a promise. So I honor my parents. I don't try to correct my parents. I don't try to change my parents. I don't try to persuade my parents. I pray for my parents. but I have no emotion, no anger, no angst, no worry, no unresourceful attachment to my parents anymore. And I don't know how else to describe this other than forgiveness, which is a relief of any burden based on attachment, unresourceful attachment to the parents. Guess what happens when you can let go of judgment, you can let go of attachment, you can let go of hangups with your father, and you can appreciate him for who he is, what he is, and let that be without having to change it, without judging it once again. You then can accept that part of yourself. You ever hear the line, what you resist persists? Instead of resisting that image of him in you, that essence of him in you, you can elevate it. You can transmutate it. You can turn it up for good. The very way that a character trait manifests itself in the world is determined by how we use it. So for example, you could say that my dad and your dad, tough guy, alpha male, and we might say our dads are toxic, but at the same time, so am I. I'm toxic. I'm toxic because I know that toxic part of my dad is in me, but I've elevated it. I've elevated toxic masculinity by seeing it for what it's worth in leadership, in service, in generativity, in speaking up and saying no to what's wrong and yes to what's right. Rather than when I was a youngster, I would turn away from my masculine energy. I would be ashamed of my arrogance. I would be ashamed of my loud mouth attitude. Now I see it as a gift. Men pay me just to hear my loud mouth, my arrogance, my opinionatedness and defiance in the face of effeminacy. I'm toxic as it comes, but it's not showing up in a unresourceful way. I've elevated it. You can elevate these very ways that your father has shown up in your heart, but only through forgiveness. If you have negative associations with that in him, you're going to have negative associations with that part in you. And it's going to stay negative. It won't be able to be a good thing in your life. So I hope I'm making myself clear, right? That has everything to do with attachment and judgment. And if you can release attachment, you can release a judgment, you're going to be free, bro. You're going to be free, and you'll be free enough to allow your dad to be free. You're going to be free enough to let your parents be free. You're going to be free enough to see your wife for who she is as a part of your body and do what's right in every regard. Dude, done.
Yo, Elliott.